So, welcome everyone to this debate. You remember what I always say when we have a debate. In the Sciences Po spirit, there is no right question or wrong question. Just like there is no right answer or wrong answer. This is about unpacking complex issues, difficult issues. Let me tell you that today's discussion, it's a very tough one. But we have to have also these tough discussions. We cannot avoid today's discussion, which is about how one fights international impunity in cases of crimes against humanity. This is what we will be discussing today. The specifics is Syria. And maybe to give a bit of a context, a conflict that started back in 2011 when a peaceful protest, like in so many other parts of the Arab world, started the so-called Arab Spring, turned into confrontation, repression, and war that has lasted now more than 12 years. Today's debate starts with photos. But there is 50,000 photos, photos that were leaked by an anonymous source. Let's call him Caesar. Caesar is a photographer that worked for the Syrian army. He used to take photos of what was happening in prisons in Syria, regime prisons, people being tortured, people being abused, executed, a detailed account of the terror in many of these prisons. Now, Caesar defected, he defected the army, he leaked the pictures, and these pictures are having been there to be visited by all of us. They can be visited at the One Saint Thomas, at our main campus. I would invite you all to go and visit them. They are difficult, they are sobering, but they tell us what we have to do. Now, this debate is not about pictures. This debate is about how we can collect evidence to fight impunity when it is about crimes against humanity. How do we find justice? And it's, again, not about pictures, it's about how we can shape a public debate about conflict. Conflict here in Syria, conflict in Myanmar, conflict in Iran, conflict in Ukraine, conflict in Afghanistan, conflict in Ethiopia. It's about also how we can rebuild societies that are affected by conflict. Ultimately, these photos are about people. They are a reminder that in conflicts, there is always people. There is men and women, there is children, and that today, in the 21st century, when we thought that we had left all these horrors behind, they are still there. So I want to thank the speakers for this debate, which we will, again, try to have in the spirit of Sciences Po. I want to thank you all for being with us today. Thank you also to Celine for being the moderator. And I want to have special thanks for Omar. Thank you for being with us, because you are the voice that needs to awake all our consciences, but also the voice that needs to make us all do something about this. So I'm sure that you will give us a few ideas in your intervention at the end of this debate about what we can all do, because this is also part of the debate, as leaving this place with a sense of empowerment to act outside. So thank you again. Celine, over to you. The mic.
Thank you very much, Avansha, for your evocative introduction, and I would like to join you in very warmly welcoming our guest speakers today. We are very humbled and honored to host this important exhibition and to host this important discussion and roundtable. As Arantxa said, I think it's about a number of things. It's about giving a voice to those the Syrian regime has so hard and for so long tried to silence. It's about thinking about what can be done in the face of such violence and brutality. It's also, I think, about preserving memory and inviting current and future generations to never banalize brutality, to never normalize denial, and to never accept indifference and inaction. So I'm very, very happy to be here today to moderate this discussion. And the first thing I'll do is I'll ask each and all of you to very briefly introduce yourself in a couple of sentences, and then I'll move on to a first round of questions. And after a few interventions from the speakers, we also will open, of course, the floor for your questions. So Clémence.
Thank you, Céline. Hello, everyone. I'm Clémence Bectart. I'm a French practicing lawyer specialized in international human rights law and international criminal law. I coordinate the litigation action group of FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights, and I also work as a lawyer for SCM, the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, a Syrian NGO. And I represent Syrian victims before French courts and in other jurisdictions, victims of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And lastly, I just want to point out that I'm very happy to be here. I graduated from Sciences Po a few years ago, back in 2001, and I'm really glad to be here with you tonight.
My name is Ziad Majid. So also I graduated from Sciences Po. I did my PhD here. I'm now running the program of Middle Eastern Studies at the American University of Paris, where I teach mainly courses on Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Arab and Middle Eastern affairs. I've published 2 books on Syria in French. One is entitled La Révolution orpheline, and the other is Dans la tête de Bachar al-Assad, which is a book that I co-authored with my 2 friends, Subhi Hadidi and Farouk Mardambeh. Syria has been with us for years now, and I hope we will share today some information, but also we will see how we can, as citizens, refuse the banalization of violence, as we were saying, and especially refuse and reject impunity and normalization with a regime that is responsible of hundreds of thousands of victims.
Hi everyone, I want to thank first of all Sciences Po for allowing us to bring this exhibit here, and I'm honored to be on this distinguished panel. I did not graduate from Sciences Po, but maybe one day. My name is Muaz. I've worked with an organization called the Syrian Emergency Task Force since April 2011. We do humanitarian work, policy work, political advocacy, as well as documentation of war crimes and supporting prosecution efforts and helping in identification of war criminals as well that have committed these horrific, worst crimes of the 21st century and continue to do so in Syria. So thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon. I am Antoine Bernard. I'm a lawyer. I am the co-scientific advisor for the Master on Human Rights Humanitarian Action here at PSIA, and I'm also, in my professional life, director of advocacy, litigation, and assistance at Reporters Without Borders. In my private life, a board member of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, SCM.
Thank you very much again. We are very honored to have you all here. And I'll start with a question for you, Muaz. Could you tell us a bit more about the photographs, the context in which they were taken, about Caesar himself, so that we understand more broadly where this exhibition is coming from?
Absolutely. So Caesar is an incredible human being. Incredible in the sense of what he did based on things that he saw and what his sort of moral compass, guided him to do. Not because he had any advanced studies in geopolitics or understood the importance of transitional justice or accountability. He knew that in Syria, for no reason, they can take you away and you'll never see your family again. He knew that many families still pay bribes to try to hope that their son or daughter are tortured less, or that they may be saved if they bribe the right person, even if that person may have died as soon as he or she were arrested. But before the revolution began in Syria, Caesar worked as a military photographer for the military police of the Assad regime in an official capacity. And his job at that point was to, just like if you ever watched the show CSI, you know, like a forensic photographer, and you go and you take a bunch of photos of a scene. And his job was any accidents or incidents that happened under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense. His job as a military police photographer was to go to the scene, take multiple photos, attach them to a military report that goes into the military judicial system. When the revolution began, and by the dictator's own admission, over 11 months of nonviolent, peaceful protests calling for reforms and then the downfall of the Assad regime, people were being shot in these protests, tortured, arbitrarily arrested. Bare chests were met with bullets even though they were holding flowers. And Caesar was asked to go cover and take photos, as he usually does, of instances of death. But in March of 2011, when he went to the military hospital to take those photos, it was his perception that these weren't people that just died randomly of just cardiac arrest, the same thing that's written on every report of those photos that you see. Of course, everyone dies at some point of cardiac arrest, your heart stops. But the fact is, he realized that these were protesters, these were civilians, these were people maybe that were just picked up randomly that had been tortured to death. And right away, Caesar wanted nothing to do with this. He wanted to defect, leave. He didn't want to even take the photos. And he went to a friend of his, you know, a family member who he asked, you know, told him what he was seeing, asked for help. That individual reached out to folks within the opposition, etc. But the response to Caesar was, you know, of course, we can help in your defection, but would you stay? And very courageously, Caesar stayed for 2.5 years and in Damascus alone. So a snapshot both in geography and time. One individual was able to compile, take many of these photos, but also take photos that other photographers took, and compile almost 55,000 photographs of men, women, children, and elderly, Christians and Muslims, Sunnis, Alawites, Shia, Kurds, Arabs, all tortured to death by the Assad regime. So just 2.5 years, Damascus alone, one man who decided that he would stay at huge risk to his life and huge risk to his family's life. He knew that if he's ever caught that he was, you know, taking a flash drive every single day and compiling that at a hard drive in Syria before leaving, that he would be the same, you know, he would look like the people that he was taking photographs of. Caesar saw extended family members, he saw neighbors that he couldn't even tell the family. He would see the mother go every day to the branch asking for her son, and he couldn't even tell her, right? He needed to continue to do this work. But he was able to do so because he knew that when he came out, you know, these families could know what happened to their loved ones. And back in 2011, the Syrians and many people, I was very naive. You know, we thought that the international community would move against a dictator that is destabilizing, that doesn't even cater to the West, that supports terrorist organizations. He didn't know that those photos would just be part of many more photos that he and then others will take later on. So I will stop there, but Caesar is an incredible person, but what's I think really important is he's just an ordinary person that did an extraordinary thing, not just a hero to Syrians, but a hero to humanity.
Thank you very much, Moaz, and maybe this is a good time to think about what happened with those photos next, and Clémence, you can tell us about their role and their importance also in a judicial context.
Yes, so of course the photographs are so much more than that, but I'll tell you about the judicial consequences and the use of these photographs in the efforts across Europe, but also elsewhere to push for accountability of the Syrian regime. So let me go back first on the context. You know, after the revolution started in 2011, there were, and the very harsh, brutal repression that was orchestrated by the regime against the Syrian population, a strong need for justice arose very early back in 2011. And there were a lot of discussions with Syrian lawyers engaged on the ground, documenting, activists, NGOs working hard to document what was happening. And of course, back in the time, all eyes turned towards the ICC, towards The Hague, the International Criminal Court, hoping and thinking that the International Criminal Court could open an investigation. Why was that important? Because the ICC could have opened a structural investigation into all the situation in Syria, but also that the ICC was the only available jurisdiction that could target Bashar al-Assad himself as a sitting head of state. So there was a lot of hope and a lot of advocacy to get an investigation open before the ICC, the major obstacle being that Syria had not ratified the Rome Statute. So the only way to get this investigation started was to get a referral through a resolution of the UN Security Council. So there was a lot of advocacy in this sense, and all of these efforts failed. And in 2014, a resolution was vetoed by Russia and China. Russia, that was later on involved directly and became a party to the conflict. So we knew and realized, with again Syrian NGOs, civil society, that the ICC wasn't the way forward. And there was a lot of strategic thinking at the time, back in 2014, about how to concretize, how to articulate this quest for accountability. And the option was universal jurisdiction, this tool that exists in a number of international conventions and that allows a judge, a French, German, Sweden, US judge to investigate crimes committed abroad against foreigners and by foreign suspects. So this tool was used, and the strategy was both to advocate in order for investigations to be opened and to then file also complaints to get investigation going. And at the time, the realization was that there was no investigation going targeting the Syrian regime in itself. So it was really about an effort of case building, gathering evidence, testimonies, of course, from survivors, from the families of the disappeared of the victims, and trying to bring these complaints and these efforts forward in jurisdictions across Europe. And also, the goal was to counter the very strong narrative that we were facing from the Syrian regime, claiming that the repression was made against terrorists, not against Syrian civilians, and that when they were acts of brutality, these were isolated acts, but not at all resulting from a policy. And so it's in this context when the first efforts arose and the first complaints started being filed, when we learned that a structural investigation had been opened in Germany, that the Caesar photos were being published. And this was a critical moment for us in the search for accountability, because we knew from the start that one major obstacle that we would face, one of the major obstacles, I would say, was the fact that no European judge, investigator, prosecutor could ever access the Syrian territory. So the evidence had to be gathered and brought to Europe, but none of these, again, justice system, judicial systems could ever go to Syria. They could, of course, not get the cooperation of the Syrian state to gather evidence and to investigate themselves. So in this context, the Syrian photos were published, and of course it came as very important material evidence. This is where we didn't have no longer only testimonial evidence, but strong material evidence that had, and I'll finish by this, 3 concrete consequences. The first consequence is that it showed patterns. You know, the quest for justice is also about pressing for legal qualifications. It's about filing complaints for crimes against humanity, because this is not only a legal qualification, it tells the story of the crimes. It tells that these are not isolated acts, but that they result of a policy that has been decided at the highest level of the Syrian state. And this is exactly what the Caesar photos show. They show that the systematic, generalized use of torture leading to death was used by a variety of intelligence and security services across Syria, and this shows exactly what we needed there, the patterns that enabled to establish that we're not talking about a murder or an act of torture, but of crimes against humanity. The second consequence is that the photos circulated among the families of victims, and it allowed a lot of families to come forward and to testify and to come to European prosecutors and to say, I recognize my uncle, my cousin, my son, my brother on these pictures, and to tell the story, to give an identity also to the victims, and to tell that how they had been brutally arrested, that they were students, that they had randomly been arrested in the streets, in checkpoints. And this was also renaming them, giving them an identity and placing the context in which they had been arrested and very often disappeared. So this is also one very important consequence, to give a name to the victims, because what these old photos are also is that they are the silent testimonies of those who did not survive. And I think that in this aspect, this has a very important also consequence, legally speaking, but much broader, of course, to give a voice to those who did not survive.
Yeah, thank you very much, Clémence. Seems obvious why it's still important to have this conversation, but still, Ziad, I'd like to continue this conversation by asking you to tell us about what it remains crucial also in geopolitical terms to talk about Syria today.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, and I thank you and thank Sciences Po for organizing this, because Syria has been absent for a while. We just had some media coverage after the earthquake. Otherwise, many people probably forgot about what happened in Syria, what is still happening in Syria. Just to give you, with few figures, an idea, in 2011, 2012, we estimate the population of Syria to be around 23 million people. 500,000 civilians, I'm not talking about those who were fighting on all sides, 500,000 civilians were killed since that time. 7 million today live as refugees outside Syria. Around 6 million live as displaced population inside Syria. And you have more than 100,000 who disappeared. Some of them probably died under torture. Others are still in horrible conditions. And we cannot even tell the horror. There will be no narrative of the horror because, as you know, no one who lived the horror until the end could tell what happened if he or she died. And those who survived did not see everything. Nevertheless, we do have today pictures. We do have proofs. The conflict in Syria, as it turned after being for a long period of time a peaceful, popular uprising, witnessed the use of chemical weapons, the use of barrel bombs, of torture, of systematic rape as an instrument, as a policy by the regime. So the regime imposed violence on its society, and this is not new. What was new this time is that the Syrians, maybe you said you were a bit naive. I don't think it was just naivety, but what happened is that many Syrians thought in 2011 and 12 and 13 that with media coverage, with images, with the fact that this regime is not killing as it did in 1982 in Hama or in 1980 in the prison of Palmyra or in 79 in the city of Aleppo, that this regime at the time used to kill without media coverage. There were very few articles, there were no pictures. Everything happened in a weak law, as if there were no witnesses to tell and to narrate. Only few people wrote about that. One of them, by the way, is Michel Sora. He wrote about it, and he will find himself 5 years later dead. In fact, he died. He was killed. He was assassinated after being kidnapped in Beirut. So no one witnessed at the time. In 2011 and after 2011, we had hundreds of thousands of images, hundreds of thousands of videos, maybe sometimes too much. But the Syrian conflict or this Syrian disaster is the most documented one in history. Still, the reactions were always very slow. Why did those reactions either were not there on the agenda of many decision makers, why there were hesitations about Syria? Sometimes the geostrategic concern did replace, in fact, what can be called a political sociology or what can be considered as crimes against humanity, war crimes. Many people started evoking the borders of Syria. Lebanon, Israel, Turkey, Iraq, the US priorities in the region, definitely Russia, but also the Gulf states, Iran, the ally of the regime. And we were trapped into discussions related that are important and should be definitely evoked, and we could discuss them. What are the priorities of each regional or international actor? Who are the allies? Who's who in Syria? What kind of political map evolved in this country during the conflict? All of that is, of course, legitimate. However, it did replace, and in some cases on purpose, what was happening inside Syria. Assad's policy was to make the Syrian invisible. The father did it, invisibilizing the Syrian society and the Syrian people so that we can only discuss with him his intervention in Lebanon, his instrumentalization of the Palestinian cause, the situation in Iraq, the Kurdish question, hostages that he could negotiate with the West. So he did everything to invisibilize, to make the Syrian people invisible. And with the son, the same policy continued. And unfortunately, many so-called Syria expert or self-proclaimed expert did contribute into that by evoking only the geostrategic concerns. So today what is important is to keep talking about the inside of Syria, about those who witnessed the bombing, those who witnessed the series of displacements, those who witnessed torture. And when it comes to this specific question of disappeared, of detainees, of those who suffered in Syrian jails, it is very important also to know that this is a policy aiming at paralyzing the whole Syrian society, because those people have families. There is an economy that developed around this question of prisons, where you have people paying money to obtain information about their beloved ones, where they might ask some people through paying them to take care, or they receive promises that these people won't be tortured, or they will be transferred to a jail where you have better conditions. So there is a mafia-like economy that evolved around the issue. A large part of the society is paralyzed because they still have hopes about their loved ones. The regime sends from time to time death certificate, without lots of details, and without body. You know that you cannot really turn a page, you cannot start your life again. So it is a matter of paralyzing a society, of creating a society of ghosts. Ghosts, you always know that some people died, but we don't see their bodies. Those who are waiting are also living like ghosts. So the regime kills lots of people to keep the society always within that suspended life. Time is not there the way it should be, because they are all waiting. They have hopes, wrong hopes, false hopes. Sometimes they might receive confirmation, and unfortunately with these pictures, many families knew about the fate of their loved ones. But we kept seeing in many places, I'm talking here because we are in France, the fact that people had questions. Either they did not realize the impact of violence, maybe they thought that there are exaggerations. Some did also work on propagandas, pro-regime propagandas, evoking that in front of the regime you have jihadists, you only have people with beard who will frighten you. Of course, the rise of Daesh helped the regime in its narrative, and the whole question of dignity, of freedom, that the Syrian people wanted to live, wanted to obtain as most people in this world, was forgotten, and other considerations were added. I will just end with one question related to those photos. When I saw them the first time, we were a group of people discussing what can we do here in Europe, because we know that in the US there is an organized work, and lots of people were already bringing the question and trying to transform it into a policy or into an act. The most important concern was that if after all those pictures nothing would happen, as if the Syrians are completely on another planet, as if they are excluded from the international community, that international laws do not apply to Syria, then it will be a real disaster, because the message that will be sent is that not only you're abandoned, but that anything can happen there. We will issue some statements, there will be a few sanctions, and then it will be over, because with time we will see people who will say that out of pragmatism, out of realism, we need to normalize, we need to find ways to accept Assad as one actor in a peaceful process, we need to reconstruct these arguments that we hear today. If that would not shake this whole discourse, there is a real problem. We're telling the people of the region, and this is not new, unfortunately, that you are not part of our community. This happened before in Palestine. It's happening now in Syria. It might happen in other places. And you keep pushing people to adopt nihilism, to consider that they are completely the wretch of the earth. And this is definitely something that is not realistic, is not pragmatic. It's the opposite. It contributes to anger, frustration, violence, and definitely it contributes, it feeds what one can call terrorism. So I just wanted to say that, and I hope we'll have maybe more time to discuss other stuff. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you very much, Ziad. But yet, in the face of all this brutality, we have seen people taking enormous risks, such as Cesar. And I'd like to turn again to you, Moaz. So perhaps you can tell us about other actors, other defectors, other people who acted to bring the truth out of the country and give us a sense of the enormity of the violence that Syria witnessed.
Absolutely. So Caesar is one individual, 2.5 years, Damascus, 2011 to 2013. And one thing we didn't know, you see in those 55,000 photos, just hundreds, thousands of bodies. We didn't even know where they went next. There was a great documentary, I recommend you all see it, called Syria's Disappeared by Sarah Afshar, aired on Channel 4. And one of the times she interviews a mother who lost her son, who she saw in the Caesar photos, and she says, I don't even know, what do you want now? She says, well, I want a grave for my son, as well as, of course, after justice. But more recently, we found out where every single body from the Caesar photos was buried. Although I have to say, most of the photos, most of the individuals in the Caesar file, we still don't know their names. We still don't know their families. Only about 1,500 so far that we've been able to identify. But we realized that all of those bodies were buried in a mass grave in Syria. And then soon after, in time, we realized that there were people that worked on these mass graves. So one person that is notable in terms of these other key individuals is a guy that goes by the code name Gravedigger. He is someone who worked at the funeral, at the municipality of the sort of the funeral in Damascus that dealt with funerals. He was recruited or taken, forced, ordered by the intelligence apparatus in Syria to take a crew and help bury these bodies that were coming out of detention centers. And after conversations with him, then we realized there was another person too that has made it out, who we codenamed the bulldozer driver, who literally drove to dig these trenches, and another one that was the excavator driver. These are 7-meter deep mass graves, 3 meters wide, 150 to 250 meters long lines. And if you look just from the open source Google Earth satellite images, and if you look at just the testimony of the bulldozer driver and the excavator driver and the gravedigger, you realize that by conservative estimates, hundreds of thousands of men, women, children, babies, elderly that have been buried there. These individuals, like Caesar, are incredibly courageous to go out and speak, because if you do this, the regime has no shame, go after your family, will go after anything. But this helped us understand even more. It helped us understand where hundreds of thousands of bodies, those that weren't cremated, there's a crematorium at the Saidnaya complex that the White House in the past had released a statement about, but they were buried in multiple mass graves. Just around Damascus, we've been able to identify 5 locations and those individuals that worked in these mass graves. Imagine today, there are mass graves being dug for people that are being tortured to death, that have done nothing wrong, and it's still ongoing. We can't save any of these people that are in the photos that you see in the other building, but there are hundreds of thousands, I would argue, perhaps, that we should be doing anything to save. And then in addition to individuals like that is the victims' families, those that my colleague just talked about, that identified their loved ones in the Caesar photos. And at great risk, when to try to get justice, not just for them, but for the hundreds of thousands of others that we can get justice for. So when you see someone under universal jurisdiction, for example, in Germany, that person is very brave in bringing that case forward, and all the rest of the Syrians also look at that as a step towards justice for their loved ones. And then family members that had a loved one that happens to have a dual nationality, Syrian but also French. There's actually a father and son, French Syrian citizens that have been tortured by the Assad regime. Someone who happens to be an American citizen as well. There are Americans that have been tortured to death by the Assad regime. And what's really important about this is I remember when those photos were first published, cropped faces were published, and people in IDP camps and refugee camps were going through to see if they find their loved ones. And they would call us and say, okay, that's my son or whatever, and we want justice. You know, we want to do everything to find justice for them. And as Clémence said, you know, Syria is not signatory to the Rome Statute. The Russians and the Chinese veto UN Security Council referrals. So we have to ask, does your son also happen to be also Canadian? Then we can open a case in Canada. Does he happen to also be French or Norwegian or something? But imagine how that sounds to you, right? That somehow your daughter's blood or your son or your husband or your father or whoever is just less valuable because they don't happen to carry a European or a Canadian or an American nationality. But that's why I believe what the Syrians have done with the help of experts like the lawyers that we have here, other amazing law firms that we've worked with and others, really forged a new way when the ICC is not an option to find ways forward for accountability, even when it comes to sanctions legislations against these war criminals until we have a route forward for that. So the gravedigger, amazing hero. There's an article in Le Monde about him you should read. The bulldozer driver, someone else that's amazing. And on the QR codes in that exhibit, you might be able to see their videos describing what they saw. What they saw is even worse than what Caesar saw, in the sense that they saw thousands, tens of thousands more bodies. And if you're a bulldozer driver and someone has come to the mass grave to be buried, if that person happens to still be alive, the intelligence services that are there order you to run over that person. If you're the gravedigger and you're pulling bodies in and you see a neighbor that you liked or something, and you have a single tear go down your eye, they will shoot you on the spot and you're gone as well. That is the nature of this horrific regime that still rules today and that some European countries want to normalize relations with. It's unfathomable.
Thank you, Moaz. And to pick up on what you were saying, Clémence, you mentioned some of the options that are not available, and you started telling us about the current status of litigation in Europe around those photos. So perhaps you can tell us a bit more about what's being done at the moment.
Yes, when the Koblenz trial ended in Germany, you know, this first worldwide trial that happened in Germany and that led to the conviction and sentencing of 2 officials of the Syrian regime, including one for crimes against humanity to life imprisonment. Most of the Syrian activist observers of this trial in general have said this should be only the beginning. And I think that this is a very valuable appreciation of this Koblenz verdict, saying, in the one hand, this is historic, of course. This is a gigantic step forward because it has shown that these trials are possible, that they are meaningful, and that they allow to articulate again this fight against impunity, this search for accountability. That is a pressing need for Syrian victims, but this should only be the beginning. And of course, these comments were made because we know about, what I would call Western fatigue, saying, oh, this is done, the Koblenz trial happened, Syrian officials have been convicted, let's go now, let's turn towards the next crisis or the next situation, let's focus on Ukraine. And there's a big danger when we're talking about efforts for accountability for Syria. Of this fatigue, we need, and it's a pressing need for all of you to be aware that any justice process is a long-term process, that it needs to be handled on the long run, and that these investigations are ongoing yet, and Koblenz is indeed, and I hope so, and we're working on that, only the beginning. So there are investigations following complaints that have been filed, investigations that have been launched before many jurisdictions across Europe, mainly, I would say, because of the work of Syrian NGOs, activists, witnesses, victims, survivors. This is their work and their efforts and their courage and determination that has made it possible. And now I think we should all be aware that they are still ongoing investigations, still this pressing need to push for justice and accountability, that for the moment universal jurisdiction is the only way to go, but that there is also side effects of all this process, is to preserve the evidence, to name again the crimes, the legal qualifications of the crimes, to name the suspects also. And of course, this is all part of an attempt to fight against the normalization of the regime. Because let's not talk about the Bashar al-Assad or Ali Mamlouk, the number 2 de facto of the Syrian regime, or Jamil Hassan. Let's talk about war criminals, criminals against humanity. And let's make it harder to reconcile with them or to envisage in the short or long term to engage in a political dialogue again with them. So this is also a tool to fight against impunity, against the normalization of the regime. And this is also something that has to be articulated on the long run. So there are still very important investigations that are, again, ongoing across Europe, focusing on crimes against humanity, as the Koblenz trial did, but also focusing on war crimes, another aspect of the Syrian conflict. We talked a lot through the Caesar photos about the brutal arrests and forced disappearances, torture leading to death, but there's also all these very brutal and indiscriminate military operations that took place in a lot of cities in Syria, and that led, of course, to a lot of victims. So this is one of the focus. To also press for investigations into rape and sexual violence as crimes against humanity, as it is a very important part of the repression by the Syrian regime. So all of this has to continue, these efforts, and I think it needs also some awareness and some attention from all of you as citizens to pay attention to these efforts, because they're ongoing, to fight against this fatigue that we can easily have, because again, one conflict chases the other. And we are, and I'll finish on this, waiting, for example, in France, on maybe good news that will happen soon and positive developments in cases, maybe new international arrest warrants against top Syrian officials, and maybe also top Syrian officials that would be sent to trial in absentia for crimes against humanity. There are also investigations that are still ongoing in Sweden, new trials being organized in Germany, investigations ongoing in Australia, in the UK. All of this has been to be followed very closely, because again, this is a long-run effort, and we need to push for it and to support it.
Thank you very much, Clémence. So it's obvious why it's still super important to continue those efforts, but I'd like to go back a little bit in history and to also contextualize this in relation to the global order. And perhaps, Ziad, you could reflect on how Syria constituted a turning point for the international order.
Yes, it's difficult now to think of what happened in Syria without looking at the consequences internationally. Partly the war in Ukraine wouldn't have been possible if Russia was not allowed to do what it did in Syria. That is not just speculation. I mean, yeah, there are other reasons for the conflict in Ukraine, that's obvious. However, the fact that Russia was capable of intervening in Syria without facing any serious, not military, but even political resistance by the international community allowed Putin to consider that he can do whatever he wants in other places. So Syria was, in that sense, a political but also a military laboratory for Russia, for many regional actors, and most Western countries. It could be the fatigue that you just mentioned, Clémence. It could be also other priorities. It could be the fact that the Obama administration was giving the priority to the negotiation with Iran when it comes to the nuclear deal, that he promised he will withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan, so he didn't want to send his troops to Syria. But no one asked him anyway at the time to send the troops. The question was related to the fact that there was either a no-fly zone that is necessary in Syria, or to allow the Syrian opposition before the rise of Daesh and before even other groups became powerful on the ground, to allow it to defend itself and the population in the areas that were liberated from the Assad regime. All that was not done, so we had an escalation in 2012 the regime started using its air force and its ballistic missiles. In 2013, the chemical weapon. Then a huge campaign when it comes to the barrel bombs. The barrel bombs are the most primitive and barbaric weapons that are used by Air Force targeting civilians in cities, in urban places. And then you have the whole torture, the machine of killing inside jails, rape. So everything was tried on the Syrians. And I remember the Minister of Defense of Russia saying that the Russian military industry used 300 new weapons in Syria that proved efficiency, and that led to the rise in the sales of Russian weapons internationally. So Syria was, in that sense, a military laboratory. Politically, it showed the limits of the international community's engagement and involvement in solving conflicts fairly and with justice in parallel. It also showed that in the region there were lots of complicity with the Assad regime. Many regimes, of course, do have also either authoritarian or dictatorship characteristics and didn't want to see its fall. They had other considerations. Then you have the complexity of the Syrian society and of the Syrian borders that imposed themselves between the Kurdish question and then the Turkey's intervention, between Iran and the fact that the Iranians do have that expansion from Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus to Beirut and didn't want to lose an important part of the puzzle or of that region that they control. And of course, the Russian intervention that was made because of the non-action of Western actors and of the UN in general. So paralyzing the UN Security Council through 13 or 14 vetoes so far used by Russia, paralyzing the UN in general that was incapable of any intervention, and then divisions in the Western camp between those who said that Assad is the enemy of his people, our enemy is Daesh, and the priority should be then about Daesh and not seeing that Assad is one of the reasons why Daesh appeared. So all of that contributed, plus today, if we look at the question of impunity, I know that there are some good news, and I'm happy that Clémence shared some of them when it comes to European courts and to the fact that there are many important questions and cases that could harm the regime. The sanctions are important, but at the same time, there is a trend more and more to normalize. We can see it already regionally. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain already have opened their embassies in Damascus. You do have the Czech Republic that, in fact, did not close its embassy there. It modified a bit its delegation, but it's still there. You do have some complicities with the Syrian regime in Europe, in some countries. You do have Saudi Arabia that is starting to move into a form of normalization. Not really clear, but probably that will happen. And then you have Turkey that is discussing now some questions related to northern Syria, to cooperation through Russia with the regime. They are evoking today that on April 4, for the first time, Turkish and Assad representatives will meet in Moscow under the patronage or under the sponsorship of the Russian authorities. So there are regional normalization. They are slow. Sanctions are important to slow them down even more, because many of them do have that in mind, that they might be harmed by the sanctions. So what Assad tried to do through victimizing itself after the earthquake, in fact, the earthquake is also an example of how bad the international system functions. In the northwest of Syria, where you have a large part of the population that was bombed and displaced by Assad, where the health infrastructure was completely destroyed, there were some people who said that we need to normalize with the regime who bombed these people and displaced them in order to send them humanitarian aid. Okay? And then it was also said that it is because of sanctions that there are lack of humanitarian and medications and medicines, etc., in that region, while of course we know that sanctions did not deal with anything that is food or medical support. So it was used in a way to say that we need to end with the sanctions in order to help the Syrian population. Many traps and many propagandas are now being used, and it is very important, once again, to keep talking about justice, the mechanisms of justice, impunity, not only because of ethics and because of international law and because of legal questions that are extremely important, but even from a political point of view, even from the question of realism, it's not true that keeping a regime responsible of crimes against humanity and responsible of war crimes and of terror, keeping it in place would be something not only bad for the Syrians themselves and for the region, but also for the international peace and for the international concept of justice and stability. So that, I think, is the key message in the world of today against those who are trying to normalize and to consider that the page is over and we can deal with Assad.
And just to add one quick comment, because Ziad mentioned the earthquake, which is important. Not only was the Assad regime giddy, excited about the earthquake, and using it, exploiting it to normalize, he blocked the aid because the UN decided that for some reason he has any say on borders he doesn't even control, blocked the aid for over a week. There were people, and our organization was on the ground multiple times after the earthquake. There were people that can hear their loved ones die under the rubble. Imagine your mom is under the rubble of a house and you can hear her yell for help. You have no heavy machinery or anything. You just have a shovel in your hands to try to save her. No international rescue teams, blocked by Assad. The heavy machinery in the aid is just across an imaginary line no further than 6 kilometers away. And you have to wait your turn for the one bulldozer in a town of 70,000 people so you can save your mom, but then your mom stops screaming because she died, and at that point it's your turn to get her body out. That's what he did under this earthquake. Then he bombed, and by our own confirmed on the ground, over 86 times, bombed the earthquake victims. This is who the Assad regime is. And tell me in the history of the United Nations that over a week, of a natural disaster of historic proportions, not a single truck of aid. The only trucks that were crossing into Syria, that were in line in very great highways, open borders, no logistical problems, were ambulances taking Syrian refugees that died in Turkey to be buried back home.
So thank you, all of you, for this political, legal, social, human insight into the situation. In a moment, we will be opening the floor for your questions. I know it's a difficult and heavy conversation. So before that, we are very, very honored to welcome Omar, who will be sharing his testimony with us. So Omar, please join us on stage. We're delighted that you can join us today.
Can I just skip stage and be here?
Yeah.
Thank you. That was very educational. I really enjoyed listening to you and learned a lot. Raise your hand if you've been to the exhibitions yet. Fantastic. And raise your hand if you didn't go to the exhibition yet. All right. Raise your hand if you're gonna go to the exhibition. Fabulous. My name is Omar Al-Shogri. I'm 27. Blah 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 blah. Studied international relations at Georgetown University. Irrelevant. What is very relevant is that I have 5 minutes, 10 minutes? How much do I have?
10 minutes, 8.
10 minutes, fabulous. All right, let me share three stories with you, short stories about 3 pictures. I grew up in a big family. I had 8 siblings, 4 brothers and 4 sisters. And I loved all of them. We fought a lot. And I'm used to be across in a place with a lot of children. All over the place. My sister got twins. My brothers are twins. There's kids everywhere and so on. And suddenly I was taken to prison. And I was sitting in a very tiny cell, in a very dark cell. And I could not see anything beautiful. I could not see the things I loved. I could not see children anymore. I used to love birds a lot. I could not see birds anymore. I could not see colors anymore because it was dark. There was nothing. People are naked and they're being tortured on a daily basis. The only thing you see a lot is blood and people dying. But one day, something very unique happened. And actually, a prisoner managed to communicate with one of the guards, to communicate with his family, to get a lot of money, bribe, to get the picture of his kid into prison. And suddenly, while I was like sitting in my very small square, I noticed that man having something in his hand. And usually it's either food or nothing. There's nothing else, right? And he had a picture. Seeing a picture of a child is not just about seeing a child, it's about seeing something normal after so long time. So we were supposed to receive half a potato that day and so on. So I had to whisper to that person, say, hey, I can give you my food for today. Can I hold the picture for a minute? Just for a minute. I want to see something different. I want to see something that's not painful, that's not scary, that's not hunger, not dead bodies, And that person was not definitely refusing the offer because it's the most important thing. It's the most hopeful thing that he has. It's in his hands, and he cannot risk losing it, even to the person next to him. And I was always good with negotiations, so I managed, and I actually get the picture in my hand. And it's like holding a baby in your hand for the first time, I would cry, and I would laugh at the same time, and it was a little bit colorful. Not very colorful, but that kid had, only these two teeth, in the front, like a rabbit. And it's very sweet, smiling, and that gave me hope for so long time. That every time I think about torture, I have to switch to think about that child, how beautiful that moment was. And the conditions in prisons are so brutal that you cannot even understand. How could that happen? How could another human do that to you? It's not just the torture. You have to think about the food. When you come to the point where your best friend could kill you to eat your food because they cannot think clearly, it's their survival instinct. They have to fight in order for them to survive, because what would half a potato do for you a day? Especially if you're bleeding out. It can do nothing. But the food problem is no problem when you are extremely thirsty, when you don't have water. Because the water pipes, they freeze, and the guards, it's more difficult for them to bring you water into the room. They bring so little water. When you're so thirsty, food doesn't matter. When you're so thirsty, freedom doesn't matter. Life doesn't matter. You just want to have water. I'm not talking about you thirsty because you're fasting, or thirsty because you're just thirsty for the day. No, I'm talking about being thirsty for a very, very, very long time. That you could imagine nothing but water. And at that time, we were taken to the torture floor. And on the way, some of the guards, when I grew up, there was like a small bag that has things in it. You put them in the water, it becomes like a really nice drink. It looks like sand. You put it in the water, it becomes a very nice drink. It smells so fruity. And on the way to shore, some of the guards were actually having it, drinking it. Of course, we don't get it as prisoners. And they dropped the bag in the corridor. And some of the prisoners picks this bag, bring it back to the room, and that person is sitting in his square holding the most valuable thing you could ever imagine. Something that's connected to something outside, connected to freedom, to family, but also connected to drink when you're so thirsty. And for the first time, it smells good. Because everything else smelled dead and pain and blood all the time. And it smelled good. So what we do, again, going back to the payment system, you would pay your potatoes to hold it for a minute and just smell it. You would just smell it. You will pay your food to smell it. But you cannot smell it for too long time because the smell would disappear. So you pay to have a potato, you can smell it. If you smell, then you have to pass it to the person next to you. So the person who captures such an investment got so rich. They got so much food. And it's a huge investment. I know it's not what you were considering to hear about, but these small pictures have connected us to very beautiful memories. And these small pictures have connected us to some hope that can help us survive. While the Caesar photos do not bring us a lot of joy, because they're brutal pictures of people who died under torture, they are extremely significant and important in the question of justice, which will bring us the joy in the future. right? And when you go to such exhibition, you wonder, why would I just go? I know what's happening in the world. I know how bad the world is. Why would I go and learn and see this brutality? I already see everything on TV every day, and I flip, and it's so dark. It's so depressing. Raise your hand if you think the news are depressing. It's so bad, right? It's so bad. But it's the worst when you do nothing about it. It becomes very depressing when you watch the news. You flip, and that's Ukraine war. Flip, Syria. Then Yemen, hunger. Then you have Afghanistan, lack of education. You have terrorism here. And then you have authoritarian regimes in China, and so on, and Russia, and so on. It's so depressing. And if you just leave it the way it is, nothing gonna change. So what happened is that every time I watch the news, whether that's about Syria or India or Afghanistan or any country, or problems about retirement age in France, you do something very tiny about it. And that something should not be tiring, should not be boring, should not be very difficult to implement. And during the exhibition, the tour, we're having guided tour, I was talking to the people, say, hey, most of the times when you try to help, you do something you don't enjoy doing. So you end up regretting doing something good. Let's give you an example. Suddenly, there's a huge disaster somewhere. We go back to Syria. Say in Syria, there's a huge humanitarian disaster, and you see a photo of a child who needs very little to feel better. You decide, I'm a very poor student, but I would give this $20. 20 euros. You give it away. The end of the month comes, you have to pay your rent, pay for whatever you need, your bills, your Netflix subscription, and all this stuff. You realize you don't have enough money. You need to beg for someone to give you some money. You start to feel guilty and wrong about giving some money that you needed yourself. It becomes a problem. Helping other people becomes a problem for yourself. It should not be the case. Helping other people should be joyful. If you cannot make it joyful, you cannot do it for a very long time. War, it's not gonna end tomorrow. Starvation, it's not gonna end tomorrow. Corruption, that's gonna end tomorrow. Authoritarian regime, it's not gonna end tomorrow. Retirement age problems, not gonna end tomorrow, right? These things are problems that take very long time. And in order for you to address problems that take a very long time, you need to do small actions with consistency. That's the code. Consistency. Because if you contribute once and you leave, there's no impact. You help in a second, but then you can create a problem. The earthquake happened in Syria. Everybody cared. They sent so much aid. A lot of this aid cannot be distributed, cannot be handled. It's too much coming at the same time. If this aid that was sent during the earthquake was distributed on the 11 years, 12 years of war in Syria, it would have helped so many people survive. But now, a lot of it was wasted. So what we need is consistency with very small actions. These small actions, again, need to be joyful. How do you make it joyful? You do something you love to help the people you care about. So you identify, what is the cause I care about the most? Everybody cares about something more than other things. That could be education, that could be gender questions, that could be war, that could be anything. You choose that topic. And you think about, what is the thing that you believe you're talented with? That could be dance, physics, politics, writing, public speaking, could be taming birds, could be anything. And there's no talent you have that could not be used to help other people. So, giving you an example, I hate writing, and I suck at writing. So if I write an article to bring awareness about Syria, the ones who would read it would be discouraged from helping Syria, because it's so bad. Because I don't like writing essays, school, ugh, nightmare. So I never write an article to bring awareness about Syria, because if I'm gonna write it, I will be so stressed about it. It will consume so much energy, and it will tire me, and I would never do it again. And I feel, that was the worst thing in my life. And then you have no impact, and you feel even worse. You get depressed about it. However, I love public speaking.
We can see it.
I love it. I love it. I don't prepare anything, I just come wildly and I speak. I love every moment of it, I enjoy it. When I speak, I don't get tired, I get very empowered. So I use that talent to help the people that need most help in a cause I care about. I care about Syria. So I use my voice, my public speaking talent, to speak about Syria. I do not write. So you find your talent, something you enjoy doing, to help the cause you care about. Because if you do something you don't enjoy, you can't do it for a long time. You cannot be consistent. You cannot be consistent, you cannot have the impact that's needed to address this problem. All right, so raise your hand if you have a basic idea of what would you do to help. Keep your hand up, don't put it down, because I'm gonna ask you what that basic idea is. Don't, whoa. Hands back, hands back, hands back. Hands back, the one who raised the hand. Hands back, hands back. All right, what is your basic idea? What can you do?
I think it's important to empower civil society and to create bonds and communities.
And how can you do that?
That's why I was lowering my hand.
I see. All right. Well, civil society are people who are working on this case in Syria, and we are in touch with them. So if you come and talk to Celine, you're doing exactly what you're looking for, because Celine is going to Syria next week, right? Celine just get back from Syria. Moi just get back from Syria. So this is the civil society people who are working on the ground, right? And there are so many organizations that's so working on the ground. You know, you connect to them, you move on. It's immediately. Somebody else who has a talent. Everybody has a talent, guys. All right. What's your talent, I remember. Siobhan.
I guess communicating.
Communicating. What can you do with that to help me? Or to help the Syrian people?
Went to the war in Ukraine last year.
All right, what did you do there?
Basically to tell Brazilians what was happening there. So I went to document.
All right, what can you do with the documentation?
That was my question.
Right, what you do with documentation is actually you can go back here and we present everything to you. And then she does all the work. Because we like documentation, but we may not understand the rest of it. There's someone who can do that. So everybody has a function. Do not underestimate the power you have. And don't think or ever say, I'm too young, or too small, or no significant, or my measure is not interesting, or my talent is not too big. That's all just BS to not do anything. Do not put justifications for yourself. And do not say, why would I care about a country on the other side of the world? I can give you a very concrete example. Allowing the Syrian regime killing so many people allowed for ISIS to exit, allows for terror attack in Paris. Make sense? It impacts you. War in Ukraine impacts you. In Syria impacts you. Corruption here, China, it all impacts you directly or indirectly. You will see the consequences. All right? We got that done? Then I'm done talking.
Thank you so much, Omar. And don't go too far. We might also have questions for you.
Sit over here.
Yeah. We put a chair here on stage for you. So on this, I'm happy to open the floor for your questions, your remarks, your comments. As usual, you have mics on both sides of the venue, and you can stand up and ask your question.
There's a mic over there, or someone can bring the mic to you. Okay, good. She's bringing you a mic. She's bringing it to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have the right to ask only one question, or
15.
I'm thinking about the Al-Tadamon massacre, which was revealed last year by a British newspaper.
The Guardian.
Somewhere linked for the same kind of Caesar, if you have took it also into your consideration and your investigations. There is a point, my friend Ziad mentioned Michel Seurat. I remember in his article called État de Barbarie, was first published in 1983. He pointed out the attitude of some Western commentators who tried to cover the crimes of Assad's father, Hafez Assad, saying it's necessary to contain the expansion of the Khomeini and the Iranian. And we saw later then we had the Khomeini expansion and the terror of Assad. It seems to me that for Assad's son also, some countries, of course, many countries in the region, Arab, how to say, international parties are following their interests. But for the democracies who claim that they are friends of Syrian people, as you noted, they did nothing. And now I'm asking about the normalization, which you mentioned. The United States adopted the Caesar Act, imposing sanctions against the regime. And then we had another act about Captagon. And it's proved the use of chemical weapons by the OPCW, etc. But till now, I feel that the United States themselves are not taking what's necessary to impeach some Arab countries. We know that they rely on the United States. They are declaring we are not for this normalization, but only some declaration.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Another question about
the last question, yeah.
The ICC. Yeah. Recently and quickly, we had an arrest warrant issued by the ICC against Putin. I know that it's because it was requested maybe by Ukraine itself, and who signed, who ratified the Rome status. But the question is still, are our friends, especially Western democracies, are doing all they can for imposing some kind of such actions or decisions against us?
Syria. Thank you so much for your questions. So I let the panel.
Maybe take more questions.
Yes, there was one question here. Thank you.
This is okay. Omar sort of introduced me, but I'm Giovanna. I'm a Brazilian human rights lawyer, and I also study here at Sciences Po. I do my master's in humanitarian action. And as I mentioned before, I was in Ukraine last year, right after Bucha was liberated. And Clémence, you were mentioning the importance of pictures, right, to give identities to what people have suffered. And at times for me in Bucha, it was very difficult. It was very hard to delineate this limit between, I mean, of course, I wanted people to, I wanted the world to see what I was seeing there, but I was very much afraid that this would also contribute to spectacularizing what I was seeing. So perhaps my question is directly, mainly to Antoine, with the Reporters Without Borders. How do we, on the ground, make this balance between showing the world what's happening and not contributing to take away even more the dignity of people we're taking pictures of? Thank you very much.
Thank you for this question. Shall we take one more, and then we'll give the floor back to the roundtable.
Thank you. We talked today mostly about universal jurisdiction as one of the only mechanisms left for justice. And I was just wondering whether you think in the future there would be any renewed impetus for the General Assembly to do more in this area. I'm thinking of some form of special tribunal like we're discussing in the situation with Ukraine, and whether you think that would be a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we can have a first round of answers. Clémence, do you want to start?
Maybe Moaz, you can start with the.
Sure.
No, so whatever.
Yeah, whichever way. But I can answer quickly. First of all, in terms of Tadamun, I think, and just for everyone to know, there's a plethora of war crimes that are just so heinous by the Assad regime. And as Ziad mentioned, it's the most documented revolution and aftermath, I would say, that I could even think of historically. But the Tadamon massacre, which was asked about, was a regime intelligence branch official who, there was a small mass grave in front of him, small in relativeness to the massive mass graves that they also have in Syria, telling people, civilians, that they stop randomly, blindfolded, just walk forward. As they walk, they fall, and they get shot as they go in. I can tell you there's more even beyond that video from the Tadamon massacre that is just as heinous, if not even more. And it is definitely something that we've put on record at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There is something that our board member is Ambassador Stephen Rapp, the former U.S. War Crimes Ambassador, also have prosecuted Rwanda. That he's been really constantly looking at all this different evidence to ensure that it also goes towards accountability in terms of court cases and so on, but also in terms of sanctions and so on. I remember that was the first question I think you asked. I'll let other panelists maybe answer some of the others, and happy to chime in as well.
Maybe an answer to your question about the setting up of a tribunal. First, something that was not discussed yet, but that that still continues to play an important role in the fight for accountability for Syria was the creation by the UN General Assembly in 2016 of the IIIM, the Independent, Impartial, and International Mechanism to investigate the crimes committed in Syria. It was very innovative at the time, and I remember that when this resolution was adopted by the General Assembly as a move to try to move towards another form of consensus or majority of the international community towards accountability for Syria, given that the UN Security Council road was totally blocked. This was, first of all, an important political move, and then this mechanism at the time, I remember that we were all quite surprised, and it was welcomed by a lot of skepticism from Syrian actors at the time, not knowing exactly what this mechanism would be used for, not knowing precisely what was its mandate, and well, at the time there was a lot of skepticism, but there was, I think since then we can say that there is a very positive output of the creation of this mechanism, which serves today as a kind of a general database to collect all the evidence that were gathered by others, institutions, states, but also, of course, NGOs, and that has collaborated a lot with war crimes units across Europe to transfer evidence and other forms of material, also legal analysis, etc., and that has also contributed to the ongoing investigations. So this mechanism is really interesting and has inspired the creation, as you may know, of other similar mechanisms for Myanmar and UNITAD in another different mandate for Iraq. And now there are discussions about creating a permanent sitting mechanism within the United Nations. But for a tribunal, the discussions are really hard, and there is absolutely no consensus. There were discussions at the time to get a special tribunal on track, but would have been only dedicated to the crimes committed by ISIS. That was the result of a political consensus supported by Western states, and that was very strongly opposed by Syrian civil society and other civil society groups, saying we cannot have a kind of a luxury international special tribunal for the crimes committed by Daesh and nothing, or UJ or very narrow spaces and avenues for all the other crimes committed in the same period of time in the same locations, and including, of course, by the Syrian regime. And now there is, we know that this is very difficult to set up when you don't have the UN Security Council avenue, when you don't have the support of the territorial state, of course, and no partnership or memorandum that can be done between the United Nations and Syria itself to set up that kind of special tribunal. There have been discussions to get a pool jurisdiction about the chemical weapons issue, to create a kind of a hybrid tribunal that would deal only with the chemical weapons attacks and the prosecutions and investigations on this aspect of the repression, I would say. But no, today really the universal jurisdiction avenue is the only strong avenue that needs to be invested for accountability.
Yeah, just for clarification, Tadamun is a neighborhood in southern Damascus, and most of the victims are either Syrians or Palestinians from Syria who were executed, and it's like it's first-hand execution. You see and you hear the criminals joking and talking to them and asking them to run. So it's a horrible video and still available with all the details on the Guardian website and on many Syrian websites. Just for the question of images, and I remember there was a very interesting and painful, of course, debate among Syrians themselves when the photos were shown, and when the whole question of bodies and the dignity of the victim, whether we should show it or not, especially that after all what happened, with all the horrors, with all the documentation, the pictures, the barrel bombs, the chemical weapon, the fact that no red lines were ever respected, is it useful, is it important to keep showing the bodies of the Syrians? There were many Syrians who were opposed to it. And there were Syrians who were saying that many families who have their loved ones who disappeared are looking through these pictures. Imagine the pain when you are looking through thousands of pictures of dead bodies who were tortured, who were, killed, executed, or were left dying because of a disease or because they were hungry. The pain is horrible. But there is also the question of, this is part of what Syria has been witnessing for years. It's important for the documentation to appear, for the world to know what happened, for the narratives of the Syrians to impose itself against the one of the regime and all the propaganda that wanted to deny what was happening in the country. And there were also some artistic efforts and some citizen pages that started sharing the same picture of the person alive, of the person with his family, stories about them, their jobs, the places where they lived, their love stories, just to show that these people had a dignity, were fighting for a dignity, and they died because of that. So I think the question is difficult to deal with, but it is important to document and to preserve the memory also of the people who were killed, in addition to the justice question that is even maybe more important in that case. For the normalization, and very briefly, it's too early to see what would be the reactions, and it's still limited. We're talking about Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia is halfway. We might see Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt. They are already halfway. Their arguments, and they tried to sell it to the US and to the Europeans, that we wanted to counter Iran in Syria. We don't want to leave only Russia, Turkey, and Iran involved. We need to have some Arab presence in order to be partners or in order to be part of any process. This is a myth and an illusion. The balance of power would not allow them to do anything. But what is important while keeping the sanctions is not to allow the so-called reconstruction to take place. Why? Because the Assad reconstruction is to erase the memory of many places, is to hide many places also where war crimes and crimes against humanity happened, to confiscate the goods of Syrians who were forced to leave Syria. You know that there is a law in Syria that was adopted, law number 10, allowing the Syrian regime to seize the property of all those who cannot physically prove that it's theirs. And we're not talking here about people who can send through USB key pictures or proofs. Some of them are already dead. Some are outside Syria. Some would not dare going to a Syrian administration to discuss anything. So it allows the Syrian to steal the property of people, the Syrian regime, to steal the properties of people, the goods of people, and then to make contracts to some businesses from specific countries to come and reconstruct. This is not possible so far, mainly because of the sanctions and of the fear that those sanctions might harm anyone who cooperate, who collaborate with the Syrian regime. So it is important to keep that in mind. And we agree, of course, on the fact, and we were saying it, that the international community was not up to its responsibility and to the international law when it comes to Syria. Not only Syria, that applies as well in Palestine. It applies in many places.
Thank you, Ziad. Antoine, do you want to add something?
Yes, maybe one aspect that was important when the Caesar files were published by the media and received journalistic treatment. Journalistic ethics includes having to contextualize. There are some limits to what can be shown, and in particular respecting human dignity. So, I mean, that aspect of the Caesar files is very important. And it was in itself a very important piece of information, not so much for hundreds of thousands of victims and all of us well-informed who knew, but because it was coming out in a context of an ocean of disinformation and propaganda, including from Assad, who succeeded in reclaiming the public narrative about the black and white options, the good and evil, himself or the devil. And so in that context, the publication enabled just, reloading our public opinion minds in saying, hey, oh, it's not only about Daesh. 90% of crimes perpetrated in Syria, in fact, are perpetrated by the Assad state apparatus. And this is also why this publication was so extremely important. Now, it implies for us all, actors on that stage, meaning us all citizens and new students, to make a very important distinction between human rights documentation, information as evidence, and information that is treated in accordance with journalistic ethics. It's very different. Now we see, and maybe it's a kind of a tribute to Caesar, how much the situation in Ukraine has triggered involvement, in particular of human rights NGOs. I will speak later about the unprecedented mobilization of judicial actors and judicial cooperation on international crimes. But about human rights documentation of NGOs, the question of should we publish as human rights NGOs, should we not publish, I think is not treated so as well as it should be, to the point that the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, had to draft and publish a guidelines for human rights NGOs crime documentation applicable in Ukraine, as you know, but not only, just to remind some minimum criteria have to be, well, some maximum criteria actually, should be respected when doing this work about crimes and trying to contribute to publishing about the truth or to justice for international crimes.
Thank you. Shall we take another round of questions? There's one in the public here. Maybe while someone brings a mic here, we can take one on the left here. Oh, it's the same mic. Okay,
Yeah,
so maybe we
there.
bring this. Maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So my question would be focused on specifically children in this context of horror, and what are your takes on what will happen to this generation of children that have been affected in this context? I mean, Omar, I know yourself were a child, technically a teenager, when you're in prison, and just all these children growing up in this context and now having such documentation about the context in which they grow up. When they grow up, what will happen, and what are your takes on that? What can we do about that? What can we do to protect children? And what can we do for children that will grow up, Syrian children that will grow up?
Thank you. And maybe those who want to ask questions, can you go to the mic if you can? And we'll take a question on the right.
No, it's better if you go to the mic so everybody can hear you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Rodrigo. I'm a Brazilian lawyer, and I'm studying in Pantheon Sorbonne an international law master's degree. I would like to address this problem to the youth, including ourselves that we are here. How we think that we are in a position of privilege, that we cannot see the situation happening in Syria for the last 12 years and not doing anything specifically, and not pretending that it's not existing. So I would like to ask you, Omar, and all, Christine, and everyone, what do you think, how to engage the youth not only here that has the privilege of the information, but the ones from Brazil, for example, that not have the access to this information. How can we engage and perform actively to tackle this? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is rather a bit more geopolitical slash practical. I'm a Lebanese, my name is Layal, and I've been here for less than a year, and I've come from a political science, Middle Eastern studies back in Lebanon, and it has been only to this year till I actually recognized and discovered what has been really happening in Syria over the past 10, 15 years, and same thing applies for the Palestinians, and it's very shameful to say that. So there's a very thin line when it comes to raising awareness and wanting to make a difference from a geopolitical standpoint. So let's say I'm in Lebanon today and I want to support a cause as simple as what happened during the earthquake in Syria and Turkey. The Lebanese people did not have the motivation to support the Syrians because there's a very thin lining between supporting the Syrian people and supporting Syria in general. And so this has been an ongoing question that has been going on in my mind ever since I came here. How do you decolonize this mentality? I know it takes so much time, it's so primitive for such a short amount of time, but since you're here, I'd love to take that opportunity and say, what could possibly happen, and what is the language that you want to translate to the people to transform sort of this mentality and think of more of a solidarity kind of perspective to enact a difference? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take this question now, and then maybe another round of answers.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Abdelmunem Isa. I'm an independent photojournalist from Syria. So my question, like how we can reach ordinary, if it's internationally or regionally, like just like to explain well my question. I mean, back to the time in Stringuta, we trust United Nations by giving them where hospitals were, and Russia's used this information, and they, in last military operation, they shield every place on the list. I mean, otherwise, like when I'm asking about like how we can reach the ordinary, the youth, wherever, like another example, I mean, what's going on here in France at the moment, I mean, and the politicians that lead this like huge social movement. I mean, like most of them, of course, we understand what's happened inside in France, but most of them, they are pro-propaganda of Assad. They are pro-regime. They are with normalized relation with Assad. So I mean, like how we can reach people like to think just out of the box, because I mean, like we talk about United Nations, and I don't believe they did anything good to Syria throughout last 12 years. Thank you.
Thank you. So several questions about, what can we do and how to act. Maybe Omar, you want to step in?
Well, let me pick them one by one. Going with the children question, it's extremely important considering that these children are the future of Syria, and the Syrian regime is aware of the fact that they are displacing so many people, not giving access to education for so many children, and those children are more likely to be attracted by the wrong party in the future. So when ISIS came in Syria, showed up in Syria, people were suffering on an extreme level that they wanted any party that can do the same brutality against the Syrian regime that the regime did against them. So certain people start to join ISIS. Those children are a target of any group that want to use extreme violence against the regime and so on. So that's when we rely on projects like the Wisdom House. And the Wisdom House is a school for orphans we have in Syria, where we give children an opportunity, children who lost their parents in the war by the crimes of the Syrian regime. We give them an opportunity to have a school, have an opportunity to have a safe place, a place where they can go and can play like kids, learn like kids, not sons and daughters of killed people, you know, not just as one in war zone. No. It's a beautiful school. There's beautiful drawing on the wall, and that's very important. On the question of awareness, how can you reach the world? That's one of our biggest problems, is we always assume that the world knows about our problems. The world does not know about your problem, regardless of what it is. Because people don't watch the news enough. People don't care to spend enough time watching a video more than 5 to 10 seconds. People don't know about the problems we're going through. That's why our work is necessary. We need to be here today and next week and next year and the year after, and we need to make sure to build a very good relationship with the dean so she invites us again and so on. So it's very important that, again, we go back to the question of consistency. We have to keep doing what we are doing if we want to have impact. Because our memory is a very short-term memory. We forgot everything. You remember when the war started in 2000, when the revolution started in 2011, and you had so much empathy for Syria? You didn't have that empathy in a very long time, right? That was so much. You can't even remember the feeling of it. My family, my mom, does not read the news about Syria. My siblings, they do not read the news about Syria because they find it, okay, when we move down in our life. So if my family, who's from Syria, who lost many members of them, my father and my brothers were killed in the war, if they can not be aware of what's happening in Syria, that means everyone in the world may not be caring and knowing enough about Syria. What you can do to reach the world, as you mentioned, you have to keep speaking. But speaking is not just words you say. Speaking is different ways of speaking. You speak by delivering a speech, talking about it. You speak by making art that tell the story. You speak by making a dance that tell the story. People like to hear things, learn things, know about things in different ways. We cannot use the same method, which usually schools always fail with that. They have the same method for everyone. You have to learn that way, right? Does not work. Especially if you're trying to get people to care about something far from them, very far, you have to make sure you're getting to them in the most proper way. Sometimes it's entertainment, so sometimes when I deliver a speech, I make so much jokes in it because I'm trying to give you a good way so you can absorb the information, so you can remember it, so it sticks in your head for a very long time. Because today, if I take you on a tour with the Caesar exhibition, of pictures of people who died under torture, how lovely is that of a dinner conversation with your family? It's terrible. You cannot bring it on a dinner conversation. Family would say, oh, let's talk about it later. So I need to make it so exciting. I need to make it as a sexy topic in a way without minimizing how important it is and taking the seriousness out of it in order for it to be memorable and interesting for you to take it, because I share the story with you, you share the story with the other people around you, and that's how we reach the world and we reach the ordinary and extraordinary people.
And if I could just add a little bit just on both the question from Brazil and how do we reach universities or students, youth there that haven't been reached, and on the question on children. And the fact is that education for so many young men and young women, not just little children, but people at high school age, people that had to escape, can't even go to a school. And this generation without an education is much more dangerous than all the bombing of the infrastructure and the chemical weapons and everything else. It has implications over a long period of time. The Wisdom House is a small example of how a few people and then American communities, and it could be French and others that sort of add on to this, helped the school for orphans that, by the way, not only did it provide education, when the Assad regime took over that town in Idlib, it was the school bus paid for by random non-Syrian, non-Arab, non-whatever Americans. That bus was used to evacuate the whole village. And when this school went to an internally displaced location elsewhere in Syria, it didn't become a place of more people that need food and stuff. It became a place of light because now it was educating even more students and others that were there. And that's a simple way, but it's something that anyone here who's interested in that sort of thing can help with. When it comes to reaching out to people in general, not just whether it's in countries or places or universities that haven't heard, I think being creative is a really important way. We started a program called Letters of Hope. And Letters of Hope was really interesting because when we would go to Syria, at the beginning, people would say, please, they'd be grateful that I showed up. And my mom is Syrian. I was born in Syria. So like, I thought they would think that that would be natural. They were like, thanks for coming here. Can you tell the world what's happening? As time went on, they were like, hey, why does nobody care about us? As time went on, people would say, well, why does the world just hate us? Why do they hate us? Why do they love that we go through these worst things? So we wanted to, and then in the siege of Aleppo, the Assad regime was sending down flyers alongside the bombs that said, the world doesn't care about you, they've left you to your slaughter. So we started getting letters of hope that we would take from random people across the world, Italy, America, France, etc., and deliver them in hand to people there. You would think they'd be like, oh, we don't like this letter, or why would you give me a letter, I need food. But they thought it was amazing. But whoever writes the letter has to know who they're writing to and why. And it's free and it's easy. And I think that's a creative way to do it there. And finally, I know I'm taking a long time. One person made all of this possible. She's sitting right there. Her name is Garan. She doesn't like attention. But she... This was one amazing individual, a graduate from here, worked with us for only a few weeks, and was able to reach all of you. And that's how many people that you can also reach on your own. Reach out to us. This entire front row is our team, and know how you can help through ways that you love and enjoy. So it's something that you're passionate about that helps, but also that you enjoy.
Ziad.
Yeah. No, of course, agreeing with all what was said. I just have two comments. The first is to my Lebanese friend. I'm also from Lebanon, and I know that in Lebanon the question is an issue of division, in fact, even before getting the information, because I believe in the world of today we can definitely get the information that we want. There are lots of websites, there are lots of media covering the events. And by the way, I'm not with the generalization on media, because I know from France, but also in Britain, in the US, and even in the Arab world, there are lots of newspapers, especially the written media, that did a great job on Syria and continues to do an excellent job. Not only what is called alternative media, mainstream media. I'm talking about newspapers, about journals that kept following and covering in a very professional and ethical way what took place in Syria. So sources of information are there. The issue in some countries that it is divisive, politically speaking. Some Lebanese were fighting in Syria in support of the Syrian regime. I'm talking, of course, about Hezbollah for Iranian reasons and for other reasons. And that led to a division in Lebanon. What is important on the level of citizens, and it's also, when it comes to the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, it's the same. To start at least by respecting the rights of those refugees in Lebanon. The Palestinians in Lebanon do not have the right to work. They do not have the right to own a property. The Syrians do also witness and live through many laws that discriminate against them. At least struggling against that would be a good beginning as a Lebanese citizen to deal with it. And later we can do and discuss many other things. Just also for a clarification for what you mentioned, because it might create not a confusion, but for those who did not follow what you mean, you know that many hospitals in North Syria and in the Ghouta that was besieged, the Ghouta is near Damascus, and in many places were underground hospitals. They were built in order to protect them from possible bombing. And those medical doctors, people working, organizations supporting those hospitals used to send a kind of a geolocalization, okay, so that through the UN, so that these areas should not be bombed. Except that Russia, being in the Security Council, was also aware of the places, and they used to give them directly to the Syrian regime or use them themselves to bomb them and to destroy them. They destroyed tens of hospitals and health infrastructure all over Syria to make life impossible, in fact, for people. If you cannot be treated, how can you continue risking yourself or staying there? In order to displace, in order to kill, and sometimes they might bomb them twice. The first time, and then when the white helmets or other groups arrive to rescue people, they are bombed a second time. So that was a horrible thing, and that was a complicity with a crime. And definitely people in Syria do not trust the UN, partly because of that, but for many other reasons, and I fully understand your frustration about it.
Thank you, Ziad. We have 2 more questions from students who waited. 3 more questions, so please be very brief, and I'll ask the panelists to be also very brief in response so that we can then have Antoine's concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you. My question is for Moaz. With the goal of ending the crimes by Assad and bringing about justice, if you could meet with any world leaders tomorrow, who would you meet with, and what would you ask them to do? Thank you.
It's a great question. Oh, so sorry. I was super excited about
Hello, everyone. I'm observing a very dangerous trend, namely that a lot of travel bloggers are normalizing life in Syria today. I'm from Lebanon, but I have family in the Zabadani, and I have a lot of childhood memories of Syria. And even though I'm longing to go back, I was always worried about, will I send the wrong message? And unfortunately, this is what's been going on in the past years, particularly because of Bashar al-Assad's online army, as I would like to call them. I was wondering, do you do something against this with an organization? Is there like an alternative that you're trying to propose? Because I've seen a lot of my fellow students even traveling to Syria in the past years, and it was very conflicting for me knowing what's happening and still happens. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, do you think we should protect asylum seekers who used to participate in the regime but are now political opponents? And if so, how could we do that? Because they are often excluded from any protective status. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll ask the panelists to respond very quickly. And maybe Clémence, you want to start?
One very quick answer to your question is that I think also that we have to raise awareness about the current situation. We were talking about that earlier on before we started our conference, the current situation of violence in Syria today. Because it seems that we're always talking about past crimes, even very recent past, but not alerting enough on what is happening today. We've talked about the earthquake and the response to the earthquake, but also the level of violence, of repression, of recourse to enforced disappearances, detention. Syrian NGOs have documented, for example, the fact that as refugees in Europe who were sent back or who had decided to come back to Syria were then arrested and detained and disappeared in the prison's regime. So this is still going on, and I think we need also to be very careful in raising awareness about the current state of violence in Syria.
Yeah, and tourism in that sense is just going to support an economy of a state that committed all kinds of crimes against humanity. We usually give Palmyra just as an example, Tadmor. That's always promoted as one of the most magnificent. And it's true. It's a magic place. I mean, the beauty is incredible. Except that near that site, that archaeological site that is gorgeous, you did have one of the worst jails on earth. Not only under Bashar al-Assad, especially under Hafez al-Assad, in fact, where hundreds of people died under torture and where tens of thousands lost tens of their years. If we just add the years that each individual in Syria, those who spent years in jail, if we add them together, would have thousands of years. So those who go and do tourism now and like to eat shawarma and to these kind of also pictures with camels as if life is normal, this is a shame and should be, with no hesitation, should be rejected. And when they go, they spend money to support a criminal regime.
I don't think anyone answered. I want to answer the question that was posed to me. I'm still excited about it. But there was another question about protecting the people that were maybe formerly with the regime, and I think that's important. Omar, too, if you want to add on to it, I'll be very brief. Is that number one? If you've my general personal opinion, not anything. If you defected from the Assad regime, then good. Took you a while to defect, fine, it's faster, whatever helps us get passed. But looking at it more practically, I worried about everyone. I worried about Caesar. I worried about the gravedigger. Not that they didn't even commit any crimes or anything, but they were part of a system. And one thing that we try to make sure of is to try to identify the national existing laws in that place. So I won't take too many people to Sweden, because even if you're there to be a witness to something, if they think that you're part, then they will prosecute you. But maybe other countries can help look at things with a bigger context and then provide that sort of nuance. So we take it by a place-by-place basis, and then figuring out how to make sure that we present to the right officials in that specific country, for example, who this person is, why this person is a witness, not a subject of an investigation. For the question in terms of who in the world meet the President of the United States, and the fact is, at the end of the day, that is where policy can lead to a disaster, as is done in Syria, and that's where a policy can lead to something good, as it's done on a lower scale in Syria. And what I would say is to have a real red line, not the one that I think was a fake red line and hurt US national security and got us to where we are today, including in Ukraine. But the red line here would be that in the northwest of Syria, where you have 5 million or so people from all over the country, not just from the northwest, they're from Aleppo and Damascus and Homs and Hama, everywhere, that have been forced out of their homes, displaced, many of their loved ones have been killed and detained. They are the last, in northwest Syria, the Assad regime believes that he can have a military victory. And he believes to get that military victory, he needs to kill, displace, or detain those 5 million people. There is no fourth option for them. Kill, displace, or detain them. So either they come to Europe here, or they're killed or detained there. And he believes then he won. There's no negotiation needed. So why should someone who understands that they have in their pocket the card of a military victory, with the entire Russian Air Force, mind you, in huge amounts, like 50 to 80% of his ground troops being Iranian-backed militias and the military, why would he negotiate? He wouldn't. But if the United States sets a real red line and says, these people cannot be bombed, detained, or displaced, then Assad understands that that military victory has been pulled away from him, and then we begin maybe a semblance of a real political process that can either allow the ceasefire to sit and let liberated areas of Syria be a West Germany versus a East Germany, and then get to a place in the future of a transition. But that would be it. A real red line, no more killing in Syria, further than you've already done, and that military victory is now taken away from him. Then a negotiation becomes realistic.
We speak very loud. I'm sure every president in the world have heard what we were saying. But I believe, too, that these presidents are not necessarily leaders. If they were leaders, if they were good leaders, they would not let what happened in Syria happen. They would have not let Russia commit so many atrocities in Ukraine. There are many things they could have prevented if they were good leaders. So what I will tell you today is that the world leaders we have today, or the presidents of this world, they suck so bad. And the options we have usually are always so bad, and that's very disappointing. You look at the UN Security Council, it's the most disappointing thing today, the UN Security Council. How can you have a UN Security Council talk about human rights and have Russia on it, that's violating so many human rights on a daily basis, have China on it, violating so many human rights on a daily basis? We have a broken system that cannot help us survive. And that's our biggest problem. We do not have good leaders in power. They could be good for something, but they're not good in general for everything. And that's why your role is very important. You have to think as a leader. You have to think as a person who would have the power in the future and today to change something. Because it's not about having a fantastic, huge position. It's about using any position you have to create change.
Also, Omar said all of this to the Security Council, at the Security Council live. And I think for the first time in history, used the F-bomb, which we're not proud of, and he could have used another word. But I agree with
well deserved. You should enjoy watching it on YouTube.
Thank you very much. So we are reaching the end. No, sorry. After you can speak later, because now I'm going to have to close this. Before I do so, I just want to say those in the audience who are interested that there will be a film screening with Clémence on Thursday evening at the Majestic Bastille. So you can ask Clémence more information if you want to join. But before we bring this to a close, I will now give the mic to Antoine Bernard for the concluding remarks. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Shukran. Thank you very much to all of you for. Okay, I'll do that. UJ in France. Okay, I'll include it. I promise. Thanks a lot to you all for this conversation. Just back on the core topic for today, the Caesar files. Obviously, there is a before and an after the publication of the Caesar files. It's unprecedented. The reach is unprecedented. Why? 4 reasons at least. 1, because we forget. Remember at the time they were published, the world seemed to have easily forgotten, or if not forgotten, looked away from the situation. Second, because trustworthy information has been, and is a target of war. I reminded, and we know, how Assad was trying to buy his reputation back, to build on facts, to get back in control of the public narrative. This is also a very important lesson. The third one is because impunity is a system. And the system of international criminal justice that is being built day after day, hour after hour, minute after minute, since the entry into force of the Rome Statute in 2002, remains very weak, very vulnerable. But at the same time, it only depends on all of us to make it improve minute after minute and day after day and month after month. This is also one lesson from the Caesar file. You know, in France, and I'm answering now your question, in France, the Caesar file resulted in an unprecedented prosecutorial decision by the French prosecutor in charge of international crimes. The then head of the specialized unit on core international crimes decided, based on the Caesar file only, to open a structural investigation about international crimes in Syria. That's one. And second, to propose her German counterpart, the federal prosecutor of Germany, to do such a joint structural investigation, under the frame of which we're going to enter all different proceedings, preliminary investigations, and later on judicial investigations that Clémence was describing and that many are involved in. This is also a result from the Caesar file. Lastly, because, like it or not, regret it or not, political mobilization needs such type of Caesar file. For sometimes weeks, months, there was a kind of, I wouldn't say renewal, a potential new step in political mobilization. Tentatives, instrumentalization, reactions, but something. Well, of course, we know that Assad is still in place and was not fired by the Caesar files. But I think we should avoid easy readings of situations. Facts, realities are in nuances. And this is what we're here for, aren't we? Dig in the understanding of nuances. So instead of saying yes, no, fantastic, very bad, I would just offer us, I will do it myself, a tentative comparison with the political impact of the photo by Nick Ut in 1972, the Napalm little girl, you remember? Kim Fan Thi, and the political impact of the publication of this photo. Let's try to understand, make a comparison. Is there different similarities? What's new? And remember, the global space of information and communication at the time of the publication of the César files, of course, is completely different from the one from 1972. Also, let's make a compared analysis with the situation of reactions, political reactions and judicial reactions in Ukraine and about Ukraine. And I would be interested if we dig the nexus, is there? It's a question. I think there is, but I think it deserves to be analyzed between the publication of the César file and what we're seeing now about Ukraine in terms of some political behavior, but in any case, and this I know, about judicial behavior. Judicial behavior. The judicial mobilization based on the new principles from the Rome Statute, but the mobilization between domestic prosecutors, joint investigations, articulation between the Ukrainian judiciary and the ICC, plus all the domestic prosecutors that have been mobilized on the basis of universal jurisdiction, I think deserves to be also understood better, digged and analyzed better. I wouldn't go as far as that at all in terms of political comparison, because I think here we have fausse route also. We need to be very, very, very careful. But in terms of judicial response, there is something very new happening about Ukraine. Now, the legacy of the César files is about courage, engagement, and obstination. That's a lesson for the citizens we are. It's about justice and accountability. It has triggered personal decisions and behaviors, including the ones of prosecutors that took it and took decisions based on it that have been unprecedented. And it's a legacy about trustworthy information and how much this is absolutely key to any type of political situation and judicial response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is the end of our roundtable, and really thank you again very warmly to all our panelists and to you, the public, for your presence and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.